Nick Duchar.
I'm Bethany Quad.
And today we're here to talk about podcasting and how it relates to technical communication. It's going to be a blast to bridge two topics that we're both passionate about, and also to be able to present together again like old times.
The dream team back together again.
From pens to podcasting, Techcom's come a long way. So here we go.
All right. So we didn't want to assume that everyone who is attending is intimately acquainted with podcasts. Many of us have listened to them here and there, but kind of wanted to go over some fundamentals first and then kind of build up what we've learned. So I just kind of wanted to take it to the very beginning. So this is how Nick and I define podcasting. It's just digital audio files that can be streamed or downloaded and easily listened to. I was doing some research on where the term came from, and it was this journalist, Ben Hammersley, who was trying to put together an article on internet radio blogs, and his editor said, that's way too long a term. You need to come up with something better to call them that will sound good for the article. And he pitched a few different words, and one of those was podcast. So it went in that article, and it just got picked up from there to describe what was the new phenomenon then back in 2007. A podcast really can cover any topics. There's a podcast that covers anything you can think of. So they are society and culture, news, politics, sports, and ours that you'll learn more about in a little bit. But one of the unique things about most podcasts is they're pioneered by individual creators or small teams of people working together. We kind of wanted to highlight what makes podcasting unique compared to some other ways of consuming content. People who are following a podcast can subscribe to that particular podcast feed, or they can download individual episodes as they choose. And you can play back a podcast on many different devices, whether that's your phone, listening on your PC, playing through your smart speaker. There's many different ways to listen. And once you have a podcast downloaded, you can, it's available to you no matter where you are or what time it is. It's just on your device and available. And you consume it without an internet connection. So while you need it to retrieve a podcast, you don't need it to actually listen to it. One of the things that we think is special about the medium for us is that podcast creators often have a relationship with their listeners. It's a very intimate medium because you're listening to someone's voice throughout the entire podcast. And if you have a podcast related to a specific area of interest, often small communities form around those podcasts and the subject matter and the people who are making the podcast happen. We did want to go over a little bit why we thought podcasting matters and what makes it something that is particularly valuable. It's a very accessible medium, meaning that unless you have a podcast that's behind a paywall, which some are, but in general, there's no cost to listen to a podcast. They're available on either your phone or your PC. If you have any sort of device, you can simply subscribe to a podcast and listen to it for free. We also wanted to kind of highlight the other side of accessibility, that many of the podcasts that I follow actually do provide transcripts of the audio. So even for those who are hearing impaired, they can still consume the content, even if they can't listen to it. We know a lot of people start with, well, I'm interested in podcasting. Is it difficult to start a podcast? And we'll kind of break that down later in the presentation. But really, the starting equipment is inexpensive. If you're looking to host your podcast, you can start with a free option before paying for more expensive hosting if you end up continuing. And if you're looking to learn the tools of the trade, there are many tutorials for free online. Also, like I mentioned earlier, there's a podcast on anything and everything under the sun. So if you've never listened to any podcasts, you can find something that you would find interesting, whether it's history or science or specific fandoms. There's literally everything. Kind of want to give you some stats on who's listening to podcasts. These are from 2019 from the Edison Research, who does a podcasting consumer tracking report. Based on their 2019 data, 90 million people in the US have listened to a podcast in the last month, and 51% of Americans over the age of 12 have listened to a podcast at some point. And in the last year, the greatest increase in listenership was from people ages 12 to 24. So I know Nick brought up that I was outside of this demographic when we started podcasting.
I was just barely inside of the right side of that 12 to 24 range when I learned about podcasting because you started the podcast that we're in now, and I joined not long after.
Yeah, we learned on the job, as it were.
Hmm. So, kind of segueing into what does it mean to be a podcaster? I know that not everyone listening necessarily wants to be a podcaster, but it's always fun to and probably useful to know what that side of things is like. Um, so a little about us. The podcast that we're in is titled D&D Raw, which breaks down into Dungeons and Dragons rules as written. We play Dungeons and Dragons, a tabletop role playing game together, um, and it's kind of a double meaning. The raw stands for rules as written, but it's also grown over time to mean raw content, playtest material, and the like. So we nerded out about our own nerdy name. But personally, I am a member of the cast and also part of our quality assurance team.
Yeah, and I'm also a cast member, and I do some of the production side of our content.
So our podcast, as I mentioned, plays Dungeons and Dragons. Although we actually have kind of two major segments of the show. There's the actual play, which is just as it sounds. It's us playing the game together in a couple different groups or parties, you might hear it called. And then the other side of it is actually where the rules as written aspect originally came from, which is kind of an interview-based show. Which is pretty similar in genre to a lot of other podcast types you might hear. One of these two would be covered by a lot of podcasts out there. Um, we don't define ourselves as professionals per se, but we would say we're experienced amateurs. We went into this to do it for fun, and that's been kind of our, I think, guiding principle in every decision we've made along the way. Is this fun? Does this spark joy? Can we say that? um, it's been over 4 years now, actually, and the time really does fly. Especially when you get into a schedule and you're releasing, say, once or twice a week. We do once a week. It's amazing how quickly that time goes by. Um, we've had the honor of participating in several collaborations. We've repped for a Kickstarter that was putting out some gaming materials. We've done a promotional episode for a book released actually by Wizards of the Coast, the company that owns Dungeons and Dragons. Bethany, I know you've participated quite recently, actually, in International Podcasting Month,
Yeah.
Women in Tabletop Gaming Month as well. And we have also sometimes done cross promos where our podcast does commercials at the beginning or end of an episode or even in the middle for other podcasts. And then in return, they do the same for us. We do have a link to our website just to give you a very brief overview. And I like to highlight this because, you too can make a professional looking website, whether or not you have coding experience. There's plenty of tool websites out there that let you make your own with a kind of click and drag approach to things. They have coding as well, but yeah, this is just kind of the front page of our website. Shows kind of like our most current episode, a couple other links to things in other places. Was there anything you wanted to add about the website, Bethany?
No, I've got to mention just having a website isn't required for having a podcast, but it certainly does help and, gives you a legitimate space besides just you could find us on podcast places. So, we have this, WordPress site hosted through GoDaddy. So for many of us who have worked on the STC website, it's not unfamiliar, but, it's easy to kind of get up and started, and it's a good skill building experience to have your own website.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. So just some stats, just a humble brag. We have over 121,000 downloads. Now that's not necessarily 121,000 individual listeners, but still, our episodes have been downloaded at least this much. That's about 5,000 per month, actually. And at this point, we've released over 122 episodes and counting.
So now that we've established our bona fides as experienced amateurs, we wanted to give you a little background on, for us, how podcasting works. Starting with breaking down, what do you need to start a podcast? I know this is a question that I think that was submitted to us, some questions about how you get up and running. And we kind of wanted to walk you through what we think are the key facets of having a podcast. Starting with, you have to have not that you have interest just in podcasting, but interest in a particular subject. There are people who just do discussion shows that aren't particularly about anything, but for the most part, the most successful podcasts have a particular point of view on certain subject matter that's going to find an audience. So you have to establish what it is you're passionate about sitting in front of a microphone and talking about for extended periods of time, either by yourself or with other people. We also want to put on here that you need to have emotional investment, because it is, people say things about blood, sweat, and tears. I have not cried over our podcast. I would certainly not think that would be healthy, but we definitely want to emphasize that it is something you are putting your time and energy into, and does take a commitment. Many podcasts fail. I think it's typically after 7 episodes, because it's just hard to maintain the level of intensity that it takes to continue pushing out content. Also, you need to have the technology and equipment. I'll go into the specifics on that later, but it's nothing that's outside of the realm of things we're familiar with as technical communicators. For the skills, we did not start with skills. We started with the other things, the interest and the emotional investment, and then built up our skills over time. And I think podcasting is a great medium to do that. Nick and I wanted to give a quick intro, little tidbit. When we're playing in our podcast, we introduce ourselves and our characters that we're playing. And I have a sample that is the first time Nick and I introduced ourselves as our characters compared to our most recent one. And I think I can hear the level of change in the years that we've been podcasting. I'm curious if you guys can as well. Hopefully, also, you'll be able to hear this over Zoom.
Hi, this is Bethany. I'm playing Saria, who is an ASMR Order of the Immortal Mystic.
Hi, this is Bethany, and I am playing Belinda Walsingham, the half-elf awakened mystic.
Hey, I'm Nick. I'm playing Tor, the Dwarven Inquisitive Rogue.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I will be playing Leuven Cromdell, the half-elf alchemist artificer.
I would like to give special points to Nick for his podcaster voice that has really developed over the past few years.
Thank you. Listening to public radio has also helped me.
Yeah, sorry, we did switch. And the last thing to mention is the time. We mentioned there's a low barrier for entry into starting a podcast, but the biggest thing that I think people don't expect is the time it takes to put out quality content on a regular basis. Nick and I did some number crunching just to figure out how long does it take for us collectively across our team to produce one episode, which is typically 45 to 60 minutes. And for us, based on the way we produce our content, and also considering we have 4 or 5 people at a time on each episode, it's about 20 hours of work across the group that we all put in between our recording time, our editing time, quality assurance, and we'll walk through what that process looks like. So it's not necessarily that's the time that it requires for everyone, but it definitely takes effort, and just you have to go through and go through your audio, improve it, and you know, some people are surprised how long that takes. Okay, just to kind of break down the technology for producing your podcast. Once you have, we'll go into like what we have for microphones for recording and everything, but we do our recording and our editing in Audacity because that is a free program. Anyone can download it and use it. It's, I think, a really good tool. It doesn't have all the features of like Audition, which is Adobe's audio editing software, but it does have the benefit of being free. Whereas Audition is now part of Adobe's Creative Cloud, which has a rather hefty monthly subscription fee. So Reaper is another one I've heard that's used, but all of these different editing software tools have lots of free tutorials online that you can learn to work through. And for us, you know, we each record locally, so we're used to recording over a video call. Everyone has their own Audacity instance open, records their audio, and then sends them all to our editors so that they can combine the audio, clear out as many ums and uhs as possible, because both Nick and I are tormented by them, and then move forward through the editing process. I also want to talk a little about hosting. So unlike some other mediums, it's not like where you make a video and then you upload it online and then it's just online and people can view it. For podcast producing, you have to have your audio files hosted somewhere and then you'll submit them to feeds. So this is the two parts I tried to break out for those who aren't familiar with this kind of behind the scenes piece. So if you're editing your podcast and you have your final file, that's your episode. It's probably either an MP3 or a WAV file, depending on which quality you're looking for. And you need a site where you can host it. Most people don't host this on their own website because if you're looking to have a popular podcast, you might get a lot of requests for downloads and it might exceed what you're able to have on your typical low-cost website option. So there's different services that will host your audio files for you. I kind of put some of the ones that are the most common. We use Podbean because it's pretty user-friendly, and they also had a free version for when we were just starting out, though that limited the size of your audio files. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just like a little site. You upload your files, you put in your titles, your descriptions, and then you set them to publish. Through Podbean is where you submit them. You submit your podcast feed. So that's like a URL basically that other services can look at to pull the latest version of your file. So it's available in these different services. So I mentioned iTunes is the original, the starter of really podcasts in general. And there's also Google Podcasts. And then the surprising new contender, Spotify, where more people listen to our podcast than anywhere else, which I don't fully understand. I would not think to listen to a podcast through Spotify, but it's surprisingly common now. So each of those services can go to where our files are hosted and automatically pull our latest episode and retrieve it for people to listen to. So that's kind of that hosting feed piece. I did realize I didn't mention that if you have questions, we do have a Q&A part at the end. So feel free to hold on to those if you have hosting feed questions. I hope I explained it well enough.
Or even drop your questions in the chat if you're worried about forgetting them, and we'll get back to them at that point.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah.
Okay, so equipment. At the high level, you do need a microphone. Some people do record podcasts using their phones or like the little mic that's built into some headphones. You're not going to get the quality you're looking for, but there are a lot of reasonable mics available out there. They can get pretty good podcast quality audio. Right now, I'm using the Blue Yeti, which I'm pretty happy with. It works well for how close I like to be to my mic, and it's easy to use. It's a USB mic, so you just plug it into your PC. I originally started with the Blue Snowball, which was, I think at the time, $49, and is a really good USB mic. You just plug it in, hook it up to your PC. It just works. Very straightforward, easy to use mic. You're also going to want some headphones. I've been using the same ones for 4 years. These are just some Sony headphones that I think I got on an Amazon sale years ago, but something that's going to help you be able to hear your own voice and, filter out any background noises that you don't want to pick up while you're focusing. We also put on here a webcam. It's not required to have a webcam for a podcast, but if you're going to be recording with other people, for us, it's made a world of difference whether we're having a conversation just with audio or whether we're able to see each other, get that additional feedback. It really gives a more immediacy and more of that feeling of being in a room together when, alas, we cannot. So I definitely think that's something to consider. For soundproofing, it depends on what kind of space you're in. I do know a lot of people, real podcasters who record their podcasts in their closets because there's no need for soundproofing. It's already all there. You just move your recording setup into your closet and it's full of fabric to absorb any echoes because the echo is the enemy of the podcast editor. I do know people who have had audio that cannot be fixed. Once you have recorded audio with an echo in it, there's really no feasible way to edit that echo out. So if you have a large empty room you want to record in, you're going to have to do some soundproofing, whether it's acoustic tiles or lower tech methods like hanging blankets from your walls, which I have also seen but not done. I record in a room with a lot of furniture and stuff, so I don't personally have an echo issue, but it's something to keep in mind. And I did put a PC on here, not because I think people don't have one, but because I think there might be a feeling that maybe you need a really powerful PC to produce a podcast. I don't think you do, especially if you're running something like we said, like Audacity or, just recording with your microphone. I first started our podcast with my original trying to remember what brand my laptop was. It was an Asus laptop from 2008 that I got when I started college. It was a brick, but it did the job. And that laptop still lives on. I've just given it away to someone else. So there's not a requirement that you have a high-end PC in order to record a podcast.
So we've talked about podcasting overall and our podcasts, but what can podcasting bring to the Techcom table? We added a matrix of just several different skill sets that you'll commonly see referred to as tech writing skill sets. And we kind of just put this here as a way to hold a conversation about how each of these relate to Techcom. And this will probably be kind of flowy. It won't necessarily be in a particular order, but I'll start with content. Definitely whether you're writing or editing, content is the focus of what you're doing, right? You have content either in front of you or you're creating it from scratch. And while it may be a different kind of content for some tech writers, for others it may not be, especially if you're creating courseware or the like.
Yeah, and something I know this kind of takes it on to editing, but something I think that's helpful for Nick and I when we've talked about podcasting, we both enjoy producing audio content, but are very grateful for the opportunity to edit things out, restructure content, completely remove sections that shouldn't be there, because we still see that words have value as a way to convey information, and it's just a different medium for sharing a message, which, granted, some of our message is entertainment, but it's definitely another way to apply those same skills we have as technical communicators to look at the content as a whole and think about the audience and assess, what are we trying to achieve? What are we producing? What are the best methods to, produce that content and to work together to structure it in the right way?
Definitely speaking is something that tech writers sometimes or technical communicators in general have to do. That communication piece, right? Something will come up where you will need to present on a topic, whether it's to your colleagues or maybe even at some kind of professional conference, or even just to learn to be able to speak in front of strangers a little better, or friends and family.
Yeah, something Nick and I talked about is this is relevant to us having been leaders in the STC Florida chapters. We felt more prepared for those roles because of the experience we had podcasting, especially with speaking, in front of people. And we did not anticipate the pandemic, but when we moved towards having a virtual community for Florida, which I'm very glad we did, it definitely was something we felt more comfortable with because we knew that we still could connect and, have these real conversations virtually because we'd had that experience while podcasting. Even though we did see each other in person while we were making podcasts, we always recorded online because it just, was better for the audio. So I think it's really helped translate kind of some of the benefits of having communication in this form.
Absolutely. I consider it's so lucky that we had that podcasting experience back when you were president and I had the opportunity to be your vice president. It really helped us gear some of our chapter communications, such as meetings like this, to be more virtual friendly.
Yeah, and one of the things we wanted to highlight here is that we think a lot of the things that we've mentioned are important to podcasting are things that make technical communicators uniquely qualified to be naturally good at podcasting because you already have a lot of these foundational skills and familiar with these concepts that someone going in without them might not have, like managing a publishing process and a schedule. Because one of the things that really means the difference between a podcast succeeding or failing is consistency in producing content and, being able to reach an audience. And that's something that we all do, I would say, for most of us every day, thinking about how are we sharing a message.
Interviewing as well, because certainly, you can think of an interview as a traditional for media kind of situation, but that also applies to interviewing your subject matter experts to get the right information and to get that information translated into your product in the right way.
Yeah, and the last thing we put on here was social media, which is something comes up all the time in TechCom. Is how can we harness social media to reach an audience and communicate a message and build a brand. And that's something that we tackled very early on in our podcast experience to think about how are we going to connect with people. Not that we ever set out to become podcast famous. We more just thought we're creating something we think is good and we would like people to enjoy it. So just trying to connect with those people.
Oh, I think we didn't mention research, but there is a lot of research that goes into your subject, depending on what it is. In the case of our podcast, it's researching the specific rules of the game that we play and the various mechanics and the new content that's constantly coming out.
Yeah, and then sort of crunching all of that information, deciding what are we going to produce and when and with who are we working with, and we really like to be thoughtful about our content. While we do play Dungeons and Dragons, we take a lot of pride in what we put together and what we share, and making sure
Definitely.
it's something that we will continue to be proud of because it's on the internet forever.
And it's genuinely something that I think both of us can think of as a resume builder, which is awesome.
Yes, I do tell people if you Google my name, you will first find all my STC work, then you will find my Dungeons and Dragons podcast, and then you will find my cats. And those are all things that I stand by.
So, kind of dovetailing into this is our content development process, which these steps aren't necessarily always linear. Sometimes you can kind of be in between two steps, or you might skip a step here and there and then go backwards. But in general, this is, I think, the overall flow. You have to start with a concept. You have to start with an idea that excites you enough and interests you enough that you want to carry it forward into fruition. It's a big step.
Yeah, and we definitely want to highlight again here the research. From this side, it's also, am I creating something that already exists? Because we talked about podcasts, there being one for everyone. There is also a lot of oversaturation in certain podcast areas. So while it's not necessarily a problem to make something that's already out there, it's trying to see, well, is there interest in a podcast on this subject? Or, am I looking to just maybe collaborate with someone else on something? Do I need to create my own? So it's just kind of doing that time to see what's available.
The creation and collaboration aspect, especially recording for a podcast, is a big one, right? And for many, one might think, oh, that's the whole thing. That's it. Uh, no, it is a piece of it, but this is where overall it falls into the process.
Yeah, we want to say this is the piece where you make your content. And of course, there's a lot of specifics like we went to with the technology with that, but want to highlight that it's just one step on this whole process of actually producing a podcast someone's going to listen to. So it's a key step because there's no podcast without it, but it's certainly not the entire process. I suppose you could just sit down and record audio with people and put it on the internet, but unless you are already famous, I don't think you'll be very successful doing so. So we wanted to make sure to highlight the other steps you need to follow to produce something that's of quality.
As Bethany mentioned, there is definitely an editing piece after, and this does break out separately from our quality assurance, at least the way we do it, because there are multiple rounds of edit, which might be relatable to those of you who have worked with a robust technical editing process. Maybe there's a peer review followed by a peer edit. This is a similar concept, I would say.
I would say we have what is basically an audio copy edit, which is just edit for taking out those ums and uhs, but then we have more of a developmental edit, which is to think about the pieces of content. Well, there's this whole section where for 10 minutes we talked about something off topic. Should we keep it in? Is it irrelevant? Is it funny but not something that should belong here? Should it just be pulled out and shared as something, a piece of bonus content, but not be in the episode? So there's definitely, we have a multi-stage editing process with different editors because we want to produce the best audio we can. And then it goes to quality assurance, which Nick can talk about.
Yes. So after kind of the initial edit has been done to boil down the raw content into something closer to a final stage, this is where we get really granular and we listen for pops and clicks. We listen if there are any even contextual things like, oh, actually, the fact that you took those 10 minutes out, you should add those 30 seconds back in because this makes the next scene flow and make sense. Or even we should reorder these scenes. That's one of the great things about podcasting and about writing, which is that you might generate it in real time, but you can still make changes to it after the fact.
Yeah, that's something that I'm very grateful for because, as I've said many times, we sound so much better in editing than we do live. So I'm sorry, we're doing this live. We'll edit it and we'll sound wonderful.
There is another page to our process. This is not done.
Yeah, I think for publishing, this is that whole piece where you're going to your hosting service, you're uploading your file, and in addition to putting the file up there, you're setting up multiple things. Your title, if you're adding any tags, so you want people to be able to find your podcast, make it searchable. You're trying to put a description that's short and punchy and will catch people's attention. If they're not already looking at your podcast, they'll be able to see what am I going to be listening to if I press play on this. And in general, just putting together all of the pieces of data that your podcast needs, like an image, to be easily identified once it goes out to those podcatchers, which will retrieve your feed.
And social media promotion once you've published or even ahead of publishing is very important, especially when you're starting out and nobody knows who you are. It's the primary way that you're going to build a listener base, so that people will continually listen and download, like and subscribe, as it were. And
Yeah. For the community engagement monetization, we have a couple of slides coming up on those, but we did also want to highlight that what we're considering the end of our process, but is iterative, is the lessons learned.
yes, that actually, I would say,
John's joining us.
I would say that actually takes place too at every step of our process. The lessons learned aspect of it. We've improved our quality assurance. We've improved our social media to expand the channels and also over time favor certain ones over others overall. We've made different publishing decisions, and we've made decisions as well that have updated the number 9 step that we should mention, which is the monetization. Monetization is not a requirement of a podcast. There are podcasts that don't monetize at all, but for those that want to, you can either try and monetize it with the goal of it becoming your full-time position, or you can just monetize it with the goal of hey, we can channel that money back into the show and make it better, which is kind of what we do.
Yeah.
So how do podcasts reach an audience? Oh, this is you, Bethany.
This is me. So we just kind of wanted to break down, one of our goals as technical communicators is to connect with an audience, convey a message to them, and give them something they can use and act on and will be easy to understand. So we want to kind of break down one of the unique things about podcasts is it's easy for you to, once you are starting to acquire an audience, to have new listeners from a variety of backgrounds, but they're in one common space. So you're not, depending on your interests, of course, you can be reaching people of many different demographics. Also, podcasts, once someone's listening to them, they tend to really drive engagement. So people become loyal subscribers once they start listening to a few episodes. If they like your content, like what you're producing, they'll continue listening. I will say, I think Jessica mentioned earlier being an auditory learner. I'm also an auditory learner, so I listen to audio a lot while I'm working, and podcasts are easy to consume. So if you're doing routine activities, for me, sometimes that's, doing dishes, folding laundry. It's something that's easy to listen to while I'm continuing to do my regular day-to-day chores. And the thing that I think is most interesting about podcasts is, this is a stat also from the Edison research, that 93% of people who start to listen to an episode of a podcast listen to most of that episode, whereas a lot of other mediums you see, like print or even online for websites, very few people read an entire article or go all the way to the very, very end. We're in a very convenience-based culture where we often want to consume content quickly. And even though most podcast episodes are 45 minutes or longer, most people who start listening are going to listen to the whole episode if it's something they're interested in.
So you'd say not a lot of channel surfing in podcasts.
Nope. Once you're in, you're in.
Bethany spoke to community engagement earlier, and this is just kind of a breakdown of how we do community engagement with our podcasts. You see that a large percentage of it is Discord, because that goes beyond just kind of one-way social media, other than likes and shares. But there's direct communication and community building. Some podcasts even will do contests on their Discord. And for those not familiar, Discord is a lot like Slack, I would say, with more of a gaming focus. Some features here and there that are different, but instant messaging evolved in some ways. You on the flip side, you might see that actually a rather small amount on this pie chart is our Twitter and Facebook engagement. It actually used to be, I think, a lot larger. I think that's kind of more where we started, especially on Twitter. And then there's this other piece, which is kind of a catch-all for other opportunities, some of which we've mentioned on previous slides. You can do streaming. We have done a few streaming episodes. We've then gone and edited them into more perfect episodes like what we're used to. But you can get involved in conventions. We list Gen Con because that is the convention most related to tabletop gaming spaces, at least one of the most well-known. And there are other opportunities too. Just a quick piece about monetization. These are the ones that we've found that are most common, we would probably say. 2 out of 3 of them we use. We do merch. Yes, there are D&D Raw t-shirts.
We're not selling them tonight. We're not here to sell you anything. We're just here to share information.
Ask us offline. No, just kidding. Just kidding. And there are websites, just as I mentioned, there are websites to make websites. There are websites to make merch, very simple. Ones that can quickly put your logo on several things, not just t-shirts, but mugs, stickers, and more. We do engage in Patreon, which is a form of crowdfunding to support creators and unlock perks by donating at a certain level, either each month or each update, depending on the tier structure that the creator sets up. And I know that some podcasters also do use Ko-fi, which is crowdfunding when charity is its own reward. You just want to feel good because you gave someone a little bit so they can maybe buy a coffee or something. So, what questions do you have for us? I know we have some that we've collected beforehand, and I know there are also some questions that we have in the chat. Where should we start?
Let's do Alex's question in the chat. I think that's the only chat question I've seen so far.
Okay.
Which is, how do you comment on an audio clip? Is it all based on timestamps? What does the interface look like? This is an easy and also very difficult question, Alex, because it depends on where you're listening to the podcast. If you were using Podbean, which has its own podcast app, which is where we host, you actually can leave comments under our episodes like you would leave YouTube comments or, Facebook comments, where it's just a little text editor where you can put in your feedback. But if you are listening to us on iTunes, there's no way to leave us a comment. You can only leave us a review.
So specifically, I wanted to understand the process of editing it when you're editing and going back and forth and and commenting back and forth. And
good question.
Is it a timeline? Is it?
Yeah, so if you're editing in Audacity, or most of the podcast editors, you have your tracks in. For us, there's 4 of us recording, so there's a series of tracks, and they all get lined up. We have a very sophisticated method for lining up our audio. It's one of those things you don't know you need to do when you're recording with multiple people if you haven't edited a podcast, but you need some sort of audio sound to indicate when you started recording. Otherwise, it is nightmarish to try to figure out, based on when people are talking, what the correct way is to line up the audio, because it's very hard to start your recordings at the exact same time. So once you have all of your podcast audio lined up, you can put little labels in. I know my husband Tony is one of our primary editors, so he puts in little notes on scenes, saying, okay, well, I know that this is the start of a conversation on this topic, and he'll mark a label all the way across. And if he sends that, bundles up that project through Audacity, sends it to someone else, they'll be able to see all of his comments. So it's sort of just like a series of tracks, similar to other video editing software and that sort of thing too. I can definitely send screenshots if anyone's interested, or you can Google Audacity. I think it'll show you that. But it's overall a pretty simple interface where you're just looking at a series of audio tracks. You can add your music there or sound effects. That's where you can go and strip out, all of your ums and uhs and edit things out.
And how many review cycles do you go through for an episode?
Good question. Okay, so right now, we record multiple episodes at once, and then Tony does the first pass where he cuts those down into what he thinks is going to be an episode based on length. Then that goes to one of our other cast members, who's the primary editor, who goes through first and takes out all the worst stuff, all of the periods where it's just dead air because no one was talking, egregious ums and uhs, the part where I go, please edit this out, which I do regularly give notes while we're recording, where I've like said something and it didn't come out right. I'm like, edit that out. I'm going to say it again. And does sort of that initial, almost like a copy edit. And then it goes back to Tony, who does the edit where he edits it more for content, thinks more about the pauses and that sort of thing. And then it goes to Nick and I for the quality assurance review.
And that part is done mainly actually in OneNote. It's taught me a lot of how to use OneNote, which has translated to actually to my career as well. I've been able to use OneNote on some of the teams that I've been on.
Yeah, I like OneNote because you can make little checklists, and then we can see Tony goes check, 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 and makes the changes that we recommend. And Nick has been doing a lot of recommendations for background music too, which is helpful. So then we have nice music underneath our audio, so it's not just us talking.
Oh wow, awesome! We have a lot of questions in the chat. Should we alternate between chat question and pre-generated or pre-given question?
Well, let me see. I've made a note of who asked the questions, and we have some folks who aren't on. We also had a question from Alex. So how about we'll do a question from someone else in the chat, and then we can come back to those questions afterwards.
Okay, cool. So let's see. Chronologically, I see a question from Lori. Let's see. How does the content you want to share influence whether you will do a podcast or communicate using another medium? What types of headset do you recommend?
Well, do you want to do the content question? Then we'll do the technology question.
The tech stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
I would say part of it is what mediums that you love and inspire you, right? Because I know that it's hard to want to start a podcast if you have no idea what one is. I imagine, Bethany, that was part of you and Tony's calculus when you started our podcast, right?
Well, yeah, and I'm a lifelong lover of audiobooks, or back when they were just called books on tape, that I would get from the library, and is one of my primary ways to consume things beyond reading as an auditory person. And for me, when I started understanding that you could do actual play podcasting, which in a sense what we produce is almost more something between an audiobook and a radio drama, if that kind of makes sense. It's sort of this between genre, but it's something that I think is a good way to tell that kind of story, especially collectively as a group, where you can kind of improvise things as you go, but also think about, is this going to be entertaining to listen to? Thinking about the medium, I will say there are points we talked about. Would we want to stream? Do we want to be on video? And we definitely thought that our content is stronger as audio only, because we are not actors.
And also, I would say that to that note, the podcasting is both great and terrible if you are a perfectionist, because you can make things as good as more or less as good as you have as the time you want to put into it, but also how much time do you want to put into it?
Well, you've learned we put a lot of time in, so maybe we're not. Maybe it's a learn from our mistakes sort of thing.
Our triumphs too, but yes,
yeah, I'm very proud of what we make. So in general, I guess if it's a podcast or another medium, if it's something that people will want to consume purely through listening, that you don't need any images to support what you're saying, and you don't think that there's any sort of structure that you would get from like a word, a document that would help convey your message, and you just want people to listen to, what are we talking about? I think that audio is a really good medium for that. I hope that answers your question, Lori.
Oh, and also the skill sets of if you have people on your team that have certain skill sets, like maybe you have an audio engineer, or you have someone who, or even just someone who knows where to go for Creative Commons music that's usable. That can also be an influencing factor, I think.
Yeah. We have, what type of headset do you recommend? Wireless versus wired, headset with boom mic, would earbuds work? Okay, good question. I use just these wired headphones. I can even send, I have I'll put it in the chat later. I made a note of what all the things I use are just so I know the exact numbers and everything. I like these, especially because if you have a USB mic, some of the ones like the Yeti, you could plug your headphones directly into your mic, which means, okay, it's bad at first, but you get used to it. You hear your own audio as you record, which is really good for monitoring your audio quality. It's very disorienting at first to hear your own voice as you're speaking, but it really does help you kind of manage those things that you might miss otherwise. So that's my personal preference. I do know several people that use wireless headphones, I think, on our podcast. One of those is because he likes to move around and not be tied to a desk. So I think you could honestly use earbuds if you want. If you're looking to be able to really kind of check yourself as you're recording, I think something that's noise canceling is helpful because then you can really hear your own audio. But you can use earbuds to start. It's not a necessity to have really expensive headphones.
Being able to hear myself has saved me more than once from starting audio on the wrong track and actually not recording. So,
oh, yeah. Number one thing, make sure you're recording when you think you're recording. We do like multiple double checks. Okay, is everyone recording? Everyone's recording. We're all good. Okay, now we'll sync up our audio. Is everyone still recording? We're all still recording. We've learned the things we mess up and we've gotten better at preventing those. I guess you said headset with boom mic. Yes, that is what I use. You have heard me bump into it. I don't move around as much when recording an episode, but I do move my arms when I'm presenting. So I'm sorry for the little whooms. You probably heard which of the springs on my mic. That works well for me. This is also a mic that can be a standing mic if you want it sitting on a surface, which I know the chapter has one, and that's what we've used for our chapter meetings. So a lot of it is just what ends up being comfortable for you, if that makes sense.
I personally do the standing mic just because of my space constraints here in my apartment. Although I have learned that for proper recording technique, I need to start using certain mic tricks. So this is the downside, that I kind of have to put my finger to my chin like this, and that helps distance me from the mic consistently so that I get consistent sounding audio if I do this.
Oh yeah, you learn all sorts of things. I've learned I have to lean away from the mic when I laugh. Otherwise, my audio peaks go like this. And I laugh a lot at my own jokes. I've learned that also by hearing my audio back. So yeah, I'll make sure to put in the chat at the end what I use and what I've used in the past, if that helps, Lori. So we have a question from Jonathan. You mentioned the majority of listeners. Sorry, you probably can hear my cat. She's not suffering. She just wants in. The majority of listeners will consume an entire episode of a podcast rather than quitting. Would you say podcasts are better than other media for long form things? Well, I'm biased, so in many ways, yes. I do say as someone who enjoys television as well. So I think for storytelling, there's a lot of value in podcasting, but especially also if you like educational podcasts and you want to be able to listen to something and learn about a subject, that's a real strength of podcasting because your hands are free. You can continue about your life working on something and still learn as you go, even if it's on your phone.
And in terms of long form, I think our general episode length is usually about probably, I would say 40 minutes, 45. One thing that I think also is helpful is knowing that, people might be doing chores at home. One thing that I've found is our format allows someone to consume one of our episodes in the time span of one commute, maybe either one commute to work, or depending on how short their commute is, listen part way on the way to work and then finish it up on the way back. So that's what we found that works for us in terms of episode length, just in case that relates to the long form aspect of the question.
Okay. Also, we get cat noises edited out. I'm very sorry. She's a terrorist and I had to give in to her demands and let her in.
I was just talking about episode length pretty much.
It was perfect. Yeah. For what platforms are podcasts typically found on? There are so many. Ahead of this presentation, we were looking at the analytics for our own podcast to see where people are listening. Current winner, Spotify. Second, iTunes. And then I think Google Podcasts. But there are many different, what are usually referred to as podcatchers, those services that retrieve your feed. So I think some of the others, there's Stitcher is another pretty popular one. Podbean is the one that we use for our hosting. Basically, there's so many. I can send you a list, but it's really up to preference, kind of, if especially where you're going to be listening. Is it on your PC? Is it an app on your phone? see which podcast services have the best recommendations based on, user reviews, I'd say, to see what you like to listen to.
Another fun kind of before and after, I think, related to this question for us is how I know in our early episodes, we used to list specifically, you can find us on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, and iTunes. And now you can find us on Podbean, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Wherever you listen to podcasts. I think our podcast is everywhere now, or any of the traditional services. So there are many of them under the sun. I can certainly send you different options, but there's lots of things that you can find. Hope that answered your question.
The next question I see in chat was, how do you find your audience in the first place?
Good question. How did we find an audience at all?
I think our social media manager of the early days really hit the ground running and posted a lot on Twitter and interacted with existing podcasts or creators within the same kind of tabletop gaming space that we were trying to inhabit, right? So that goes back to the research aspect a bit.
Yeah, the collaborations for us were really key, but people who are already an established audience who thought, well, we like what you're doing. We've listened to your podcast. We think we would like to share that with our listeners and do sort of a mutual exchange of promotion early on. But also for us, just interacting with people who were talking about our area of interest on Twitter, which for us was Dungeons and Dragons rules, and just, providing advice, insight, and not always just plugging our podcast all the time. I think some people make the mistake of, I have something to promote, and then their whole social media strategy is promote, 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 promote. And if the people aren't engaging with what you're putting out there, it's not going to get in front of more eyeballs. The algorithm's not going to favor it if people aren't actually responding. So it's really important to actually be human, I think. Ask questions, respond to people, and just have a human presence behind. Sorry, my cat's trying to do something. Behind your social media engagement, so it doesn't sound robotic or planned or corporate, but just has a human voice. So I think having experience in marketing is really helpful there if you're looking to kind of get some traction. And also just being really patient. Our first few months, we were super happy when we figured out that anyone had listened to our podcast who was not somebody we already knew. So that was very exciting for us. Oh no, Frank says he found our podcast. We are not actually here to plug our podcast. I'm not going to discourage you from listening to it, but if you listen to our older stuff, we've come a long ways. And if you listen to our current stuff and you don't know about Dungeons and Dragons, it will be very confusing. But I am proud of what we make.
We're actually reduxing some of our stuff right now too, so that's been fun.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So Sarah, sorry, also asked, did we do ads? No, we did not, because not that we're opposed, and I think it can work well if you have a really specific audience you're trying to reach. You want people who are interested in X subject and you want to reach those people. There's a lot of great opportunities to do ads through Facebook or Twitter for those things. Maybe through Instagram. I don't have as much experience there. But for us, we're starting with, our budget is nothing beyond the money we have spent on equipment. We have microphones. That's all. We're just going to see where this goes and see if we like making it. So we just kind of had a more organic approach, I think, early on.
Let's see. What got us each interested in making podcasts? For me, it was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, one of which I am presenting with now.
Hey! For me, it was having a conversation with one of our other friends who originally started the podcast with us, which I would call the equivalent of the modern day, we should totally start a band conversation, where you're sitting around with your friends and you're like, man, we really have something interesting to say on this subject. We're creative, fun people. We should totally start a podcast. Everyone's like, yeah, having no idea what that means or what sort of thing we're committing to, but wanting to do a collective project together with our friends. So, and having been someone who enjoyed podcasts and listening to them, I was like, yeah, this will be great. We'll definitely make something that we can enjoy. I don't know how long it'll last. We'll see. We'll just give it a try and see if we like it. And so far we have. So far, so good.
Here we are now, 4 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Do you think it's more important, this is from Jessica, do you think it's more important to have a favorite subject and then fall into podcasting, or just want to podcast?
Important is, I'm like, what do you mean by important? Can you give me some synonyms? So I guess it kind of depends on what your goal is. If your goal is just to have the experience of having a podcast, you can podcast about nothing. I mean, Seinfeld was a show about nothing. It wasn't really, but in a sense, if you just want to create some audio and share it with an audience, or put it out there and see who listens to it, or even just share it with people close to you, there's nothing to say you must have like a subject matter expertise in order to be a voice on the internet. I wouldn't worry about that. Some people just, talk about their life stories or their experience in the field. Like, there are podcasts on what is it like to be a tech writer. It doesn't have to be something super specialized. But
I am at. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, you go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I imagine that probably some people, either for a school project or just feeling their oats on this, have even done a podcast with a purposefully finite amount of content. Like, oh, I just want to put out 5 episodes, a little mini series on a topic, and that's a way that if you just want a podcast, you can see what it's like, see if it's for you.
Mm-hmm. You could also do a podcast on podcasting.
If I may chip in on this answer.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I've listened to a podcast in the past that had a 3-topic per episode format, and the topics were usually pretty random. Currently, I'm listening to one where there is no structure, there is no topic. It's just 4 guys on a podcast talking about whatever comes into their heads.
That actually sounds really entertaining.
It is.
Of course, you have to be an entertaining person. So much pressure.
It's all better in post.
Right? Thank goodness.
Let's see.
Okay. So, and I'll put my equipment list. Hopefully, I didn't put specific links or anything, but hopefully that all makes sense. And approximate prices, just in case anyone's interested. I did try to put together what I spent on podcasting in the first year, I think, but that was like collectively once we were doing hosting and everything. It was about $200, I think, between equipment, hosting, the website, stuff like that. So for something we've continued to this day, it's pretty reasonable. So we did have some other questions submitted, but feel free to put any more in the chat if you have them.
Okay, I'll start with Alex's question from the top of the bullets here.
We answered that one, so there we go. Sorry,
I'll start from Miranda's question from the top of the bullets here.
Mm-hmm.
How much does it cost in specialized software or equipment to launch?
I guess I sort of answered that one. It was about $200. Granted, that was 4 years ago, and it depends on how fancy you want to be early on and how much you want to have room to grow, which is kind of what happened with us, where we thought, well, if we keep going, we'll get better. And we did over time, with our equipment and also our skills.
Yeah, it really depends, on what you're going for right from the start. If you want to start slow and build up as we did, the cost can be pretty low, especially if you take advantage of free software like Audacity or freemium pricing scales like from Podbean. Mm-hmm. Part 2 of this question was how many episodes should you have prior to launch? Which I think to begin to answer that, you first need to know what your release schedule is going to be. Some podcasts release once a week, as we do. Some podcasts release multiple times a week. And then to have a sense of, okay, now that I know how often I'm releasing, let's multiply that by the number of weeks. How much do I want to plan for some life event, like if I want to go on a 2-month vacation, or if I suddenly have some family stuff come up, I need to take a month off? I would say at minimum, probably a couple months worth of episodes would be a good place. What do you think, Bethany?
I would say more than we had, which was, I think, 2. When we first started, I was like, we'll put on the internet and see what happens. So learn from our mistakes. We had some very stressful weekends of last minute editing because we were committed to our release schedule, which at that time was every other week. Some would say bi-weekly, but bi-weekly is a word that just is very confusing. We did not go twice a week. But I think overall, a lot of people do get into trouble because they don't plan for a backlog. If you think podcasting is something you seriously want to do, then I totally recommend taking the time, like Nick said, to build up 2 or 3 months of episodes ahead. So then ideally you can continue to prepare your content ahead. You can have it all set to publish. And then, you don't have to worry as much or, be under a time crunch. It is also possible to just miss a week. That's something we've worked on. Where I'm like, sometimes we just need to take some time off. We took a month off this summer, which was really good, I think, for us. Kind of gave us a time to reset and reevaluate what we were doing with some of our content. But planning to edit, record, edit, and release every week is not really sustainable for human beings.
Yeah, especially if you go with a multiple times a week format. Plus, depending on how your format goes, you might also be building a backlog that increases slowly over time, as I think ours does.
Right now, on our current release schedule, there are things that we have recorded that if we continue at this rate will not be released for a year, which is very strange in one way to think about. It creates this weird sort of time experience where I know that I'm recording things now that won't be heard by anyone for a very long time. It is also weird releasing a podcast because you will find people who discover your podcast, start listening to it from the beginning, and ask you questions about things that your past self said 4 years ago. And it's very hard to remember everything I said 4 years ago. But I guess that's just one of the hazards of having your content on the internet.
To them, it's like it was just yesterday because it was.
It's so immediate. Yeah, podcasting is actually a very intimate medium because when you're listening to someone, especially if it's a conversational podcast, for many people, it's like they're there and part of the conversation. So I think we've got another question that was submitted ahead.
Yeah, it looks like one or two additional. Okay, this one's from Alex. Is it worth it to join the premium tiers of podcasts through Patreon, etc.? So it's case by case, in my opinion. I mean, once you get a sense of what the creator puts out and what you feel about the content, if you feel inclined to support them, then that's awesome. And you can also take a look at the tiers of rewards that have been set up and see if those appeal to you, and that might also guide your interest a bit.
Yeah, we didn't talk about advertisements as a way to sustain a podcast. We did some advertising early on, but didn't really focus on it because it just didn't really gel with our process. But I do think if you really enjoy a podcast and you want to support the creators, I think it's worthwhile if you have the financial means to support them through whatever means, whether that's Patreon. But I don't think there's any obligation. And if it's just not something that you feel compelled to do, I don't think there's any pressure. They will create the podcast regardless. And if they're telling you they won't, that's probably not, you shouldn't be giving the money if they're giving the money. But podcasts do come with associated costs, so a lot of people are trying to cover their costs or invest in new equipment. So I guess it's sort of up to you on whether it's worth it or not. It like Nick said, it depends.
I've actually found it valuable to me as a member of the podcast who doesn't run our Patreon feed, but who is, a cast member, to just donate a very small amount each month. I think $1 a month. And that gives me instant access to the Patreon feed itself. And it's just nice to get a pulse of how the Patreon feed is interacting with patrons by getting the instant updates through my email client of, oh, this is what our podcast just put out, and here's some of the content that we're sharing.
Yeah, and for some people also Patreon or similar services are where they have their community hub. So if you're looking to interact with other people about the podcast, that can be a good space to do so.
The next question I see is one from Kurt. Let's see. How do you think we can apply your tips for podcasting on technical writing towards podcasting on political matters?
Well, there's a part of me that says, oh no, politics. But, I'm just a little shell shocked from the past months, years. Hard to say, I think, like you said, we have an interview-based show, and it doesn't matter that much what your subject matter is. If you're sitting down with someone else to interview them about the particular topic, all the same principles apply for what we talked about with the process for creating your content and, editing it and, producing and publishing it. So I think that definitely does apply.
One thing that we noticed as we were researching for this presentation, and of the different kinds of podcasts, which we do have some recommendations on an upcoming slide, so stay tuned. But sorry, podcasting voice, it's fun. One thing we noticed is there are actually, there's a market for political podcasts out there. There are a ton of them that are pretty popular from what we can tell. And I think that one way that it relates to technical writing, if you're going to focus on a political topic, is knowing your audience, which is definitely a technical writing tenet that you've probably heard, especially if you're going to be talking about something that might be polarizing or divisive. It's good to know who you're trying to reach and how to best reach them.
Yeah, and I will say, if it's something where you have a particular point of view, like Nick said, that might be polarizing, you might get feedback. We overall get pretty positive feedback from people who do, contact us about the podcast. Sometimes it's questions about something we said about a rule in an episode, or it's just to say they like the podcast or they're curious about something from one of the characters. But we did get a very lengthy screed one time complaining about me. Um, I think it was though I was uppity, basically. So there is a chance that you will get negative feedback on your podcast, and more personally, on you as a human being. Which, don't worry, my confidence is not diminished. I was more annoyed than anything else, and I think it was mostly misogyny. If that helps. It doesn't, but I'm pretty sure that was the point of view for that particular message. So there is always a chance that you will get responses on what you are creating. So it's just something to be emotionally prepared for.
I appreciate that you took that annoyance with it and really channeled it into the content itself and continued improvement of the show.
And Jessica's right. Uppity is a trigger word. Yes. It's like being called hysterical. Also, where you're like, it's a very, very gendered language. So just sharing that personal experience. But yeah, I'd say if you want to make a podcast, like I'm all for go for it. You have questions, let us know. We're happy to help you. We have helped a few other people start podcasts because it's a fun experience, especially if it's something you're doing with people you enjoy working with.
And I see one additional question. Bethany, would you like to introduce it?
Oh, I think it was the one that we put for ourselves. Yeah, we want to talk about a little bit the differences of recording something solo or recording something in a team, since our experience has all been collaborative, where we are recording episodes, like I said, with 4 or 5 of us together, all on a call, working on a particular subject and talking through it. And, that experience is very different from someone who's just recording, in their own space, a solo podcast, though those also can be very popular. I think Nick and I were particularly talking about the writing piece of this, where we do have some scripted sections. And if you're recording a solo podcast, a lot of people script those. So there's a heavy writing component.
Yes, definitely. For me, my character has pen pals, and so I write letters for my character that I actually record separately and send those in. So there is a piece there. And I know that just in terms of the editing, Tony has talked before on some of our episodes about back when he was doing all of the editing and all of the QA, and how that was a lot to keep up with the schedule on. So definitely sharing the load on various pieces such as writing, editing, QA with other team members can be rewarding, especially if you work well with those individuals.
Yeah, I think for us, it's been really key having that team dynamic, because if it was just me, the podcast would not have continued, because I would not have the mental space or even the talent at certain aspects of the process to continue producing it. I am not a very good editor. I'm very slow, and I get frustrated easily when it comes to audio. I think that's part of being an auditory person. I get very perfectionist about it. So I'm much better in QA than I am in editing.
Yeah, and even in QA, we approach it with our own personalities and styles, and I think we build off of each other, and we're better because we have sounding boards of our teammates.
But if you are wanting to record something solo, let us not deter you from that. For one thing, your editing will be so much easier if you're editing the audio of one person rather than several. So it's certainly a lighter load if that's something you want to pursue.
Plus, you have 100% ownership of it, which sounds awesome and terrifying at the same time, right? Depending on how you feel about that.
Empowering. We'll say empowering.
Empowering. Yes. Sorry, that was awesome. It was empowering or terrifying.
Yeah. Did we have any other questions, or were there any in the chat?
I have a verbal question.
All right, go for it.
Where do you find the time to do all this stuff and everything else you have to do?
Deborah, I don't know what downtime is.
I was gonna say.
Well, and like we mentioned, we don't record every week. We record basically batch sessions. So if we record for 5 hours at a time, that's 4 to 5 episodes. So we record for a bit, and then we have time off from recording, and it goes into the editing process. That's why we have that backlog. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do it.
I know, just recording and editing and that, and your job and STC, and I'm amazed.
Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, wow, how did we get here?
It helps that we're really invested in each other's emotional and mental well-being, and if someone needs a break, they take the break.
Yeah, it is also something we remind ourselves we're doing for fun and, do it insofar as we enjoy it. And we do take breaks, and we do carry different parts of the load. It's no one person, carrying the podcast on their shoulders. Though for a while it was my husband, but we've managed to spread it out so he's not too stressed. So I find the time on my Google Calendar when there is a white spot without any colored events on there. That's where it goes.
Amazing.
Yeah. If anyone else wants to unmute and ask a question, feel free. Oh, and Jessica said that's where really loving the subject matter matters. Really loving the subject matters. Nailed it. Absolutely. I think if we lost interest in the content itself and what we were creating, that would definitely be demoralizing. But I think for us, we're working on a really creative podcast. So we have the opportunity to continue to contribute new ideas, and it's really an outlet. At least for me. I don't know about you, Nick.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's, I've always wanted to express creativity and tell a story. And it's so much less daunting if you're doing that as a team, I feel. So it's been a great outlet.
Yeah.
Plus, it's playing games. I mean, what's not to love?
We do play games for our podcast, so we do make it fun. All right. A last call for questions. We can always do some more at the end, but we do have a couple more slides if there's nothing else. Okay.
All right. So, what podcasts do we recommend?
Mm-hmm. Well, we wanted to give you some Techcom recommendations and then a few others that are areas of interest. One that I recently discovered was 10-Minute Techcom. We talked about how our podcast is 45 minutes to an hour. These are 10-minute episodes where they cover different Techcom topics with different guest stars, guest contributors. So if there's an area of Techcom you're interested in, you have 10 minutes, you can listen to the podcast. And they have episodes going back quite a few years. So all of these are Googleable, by the way. I didn't give you links because that's the hard thing for podcasts. I can't give you a link to where it lives because it lives everywhere, but you should be able to find all of these by name. Write the Docs, which is a documentation-driven community, also has a community podcast. So they have a similar structure where they have guests who join and share what it's like working in the specific part of the field they're in and what they've learned through that experience. So it's pretty conversational. So if you're looking for something where you just want to listen in and hear what it's like and a job that you don't have, that's a pretty good one. I'd Rather Be Writing is Tom Johnson's podcast. So it's pretty specialized in different areas of podcast, not just different areas of Techcom, not just writing. And he has a pretty significant catalog of different topics that you can listen to, and they're all very clearly labeled. So if you were thinking, well, I want to listen to something on this, that's a really good one to go for. The Not Boring Tech Writer podcast was another one I thought. Now, first part of me was a little offended where I'm like, what do you mean? Are there boring tech writers? I think we're all interesting. But it's more about playing against that stereotype that might be held by people outside of tech writing that what we do is boring, which I think is often a misconception. So it's sort of breaking down some of those stereotypes and talking about what makes tech writing unique and what we bring to the table in the field. So I think it's empowering if you're, in any sort of marginalized position as a tech writer and, want to hear what others are going through. And for those who are looking for something on content strategy, the aptly named The Content Strategy Experts Podcast. They don't mess around. They wanted to tell you what the podcast is. That's what it's, they break down every facet of content strategy. And I know that's something I'm always trying to learn more about. And sometimes I don't have time to sit and read many articles. So it's nice to be able to consume that in audio format. We have a few other recommendations here. I have to explain each one because they're disparate. Well, two of them are on writing. Nick and I talked about Grammar Girl. It was really good. If you are a grammar nerd, not that I want to stereotype tech writers, because I was just saying that's not a good idea, but many of us are grammar nerds. And, think words matter, punctuation matters. If you fought someone over a comma, this is probably a good podcast for you.
And this one actually started out as a website and then developed into a podcast later on, didn't it?
Yeah, and that's something that does happen where somebody, decides that podcasting is a great medium for sharing, their message or part of it. And it's, easy to produce that content if you already have a website and share it there. Writing excuses is more of a general writing principles. podcast if you're looking to, gain some more insight into how you can improve your writing skills. We also want to call out, our STC immediate past president, Ben Wilkes, Hope for the Introvert podcast. For those who don't know Ben, he is a lifelong introvert who talks extensively about how you can harness the power of introversion to be an influential leader without having to be that sort of stereotypical type A, charismatic, in your face sort of leader. So he does a lot of interviews with people who share their experiences as introverts. A lot of well-known, I was going to say faces, well-known voices in STC have been on his podcast. So that's definitely one I think you should give a listen to. It's very, very supportive. It's a nice podcast. And then for complete change of pace, I put Serial on here. So if you have not listened to any podcast or have not been interested in the podcasting space, Serial is not the first podcast, but I'd say it's one of the first ones to receive national attention back in, I think, 2014 and really kickstart podcasting as a way to tell a message. So it's a nonfiction crime podcast. It's very, very good. If you like nonfiction and crime and want to kind of go back to some earlier podcasting roots, I highly recommend it. So I just want to put that on there if you're new to podcasting.
I think in our research, we found there are a lot of true crime podcasts, probably a lot of them inspired by Serial, right?
Definitely. And if you guys actually have any podcast recommendations, feel free to put those in the chat. We only put a few because we didn't want to overwhelm or go too wild on our subject matter. But I know there's a lot of great podcasts out there. As we said, a podcast for everyone. And then for our last slide, we just had a few articles. I will be setting out the slides, so don't worry, you'll be able to click the links. Just on some recommended reading if you're learning to build some more knowledge on Techcom and how it relates to podcasting. It's, I think, a relatively new area for Techcom. Like we said, there's some specific Techcom related podcasts, but from the corporate side of things, I don't see it something that's being embraced yet, but I definitely think it's a technology where we are uniquely positioned to adapt to the medium. So I think that's the end of our presentation. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
It's been really fun to share two of our great loves, Techcom and podcasting, with you and how they relate. Thank you all for your participation and your questions. It's been a blast.
Yeah, thank you.
This is really good. You guys are good at this.
Did we sound like we know what we're talking about, WC?
Yeah, wow.
You did.
Fooled me.
Professional amateurs. That's what we are.
That was really good.
Well, thank you. I'm glad
Great
you enjoyed
job.
it.
Hey, John.
Oh, hey. Yeah,
Yeah.
my camera. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was a really great presentation.
Well, good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Very good
Thank you.
job.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem. If you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'll send out an email with the link to the recording for anyone who missed part of it, and also a link to the slides. Sorry, now I realize I'm like now everybody's all across my screen. It's nice to see your faces. But if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us an email or, recommend a podcast to us. Always looking for things to listen to, especially now that I don't leave my house much. I have lots of time to listen to things as I go about my daily life. Granted, there's cats in the background, but that's also part of my daily life.
I really like 10% happier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's that one about?
I guess it's kind of about like the science of happiness and being happier in everyday life. It's there's a book that's by the same title that got me into it in the first place.
I listened to that one too. I think he's an ABC News anchor, and his name is Dan Harris. He's an anchor now, and he had like a meltdown on camera because he was so stressed out and he couldn't handle things without taking some kind of drug. He was on some kind of drug which just led him to an anxiety attack on air, and so he started meditating. And so it's kind of the interview. It's mainly about meditation, but there's other aspects of how you can deal with stress and decompress.
I know exactly who you're talking about. Yep.
Managing social anxiety and all that.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty relatable for a lot of us.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I believe he was the weekend host of Good Morning America that was on the weekends. Yeah, I remember him talking about that.
I have not listened to that one, but
Very cool.
It'll go on my list.
The freeform one I was talking about earlier is called Disc Only. Fair warning, there is strong language. It may or may not be safe for work.
Oh, that is
just because of the strong language.
Yeah. Gotta put your hands up, make sure we don't get confused.
Don't get me in trouble, guys. I'm not trying to get you in trouble either.
I will say that's actually something interesting about podcasting. When you are setting up your podcast and submitting your feed, whether your podcast is explicit or not is a binary choice. It is or it isn't. There are no ratings for podcasts, and it's something you self-select. So your podcast is either clean, meaning you're claiming you don't have any cursing, it's something acceptable that anyone could listen to, or it's explicit. You have cursing, you have, adult subject matter, and that's something you self-select when you are submitting your podcast feed. So if you're starting a podcast, you have to choose which path you're going. We went curse-free, which is easy for me and more challenging for some of the other members of the podcast. Not Nick, I don't think.
No, not really. But there's editing, so
yes.
You'll never know who we're talking about.
But just one of those funny quirks.
Yeah.
Any last questions or thoughts to share with the group?
Oh, okay. We're coming up on the end of the time frame, and last chance. Anybody? Awesome presentation, guys. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank
Very
you.
Great.
I don't know if we've got the what's settled for the November presentation, but that'll come out shortly. I know we were working on doing something with the Texas group, and we're trying to still figure out. I'm getting emails back on whether it's recorded and we can play it at the normal hour, or if he'll do another one that's live. So we're still working on that. So we'll let everyone know. But
okay.
Very shortly. But thank you.
Yeah, we hope you all enjoyed the fun fall theming. We wanted to evoke the feeling of a season that we don't get to experience here. So hope you enjoyed it very much. And I think, we're right at 8:30. Look at that great timing. Thank you all very much.
Very
hope you all have
good.
a wonderful evening.
Very good.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in November.
See ya.